stone with some modifications, transferring the scene of the events from the east to the west. Moreover, he mentions those 10 generations as well as that earth which lies beyond the ocean. And in a word, it is evident that all of them borrow from Moses, and publish his statements as their own. Modern. Aside from Plato's original account, modern interpretations regarding Atlantis are an amalgamation of diverse, speculative movements that began in the 16th century when scholars began to identify Atlantis with the New World. Francisco López de Gomara was the first to state that Plato was referring to America, as did Francis Bacon and Alexander von Humboldt. Janus Jonas Burcherod said in 1663, Orb novo non novo, the New World is not new. Athanasius Kircher accepted Plato's account as literally true, describing Atlantis as a small continent in the Atlantic Ocean. Contemporary perceptions of Atlantis share roots with Mayanism, which can be traced to the beginning of the modern age, when European imaginations were fueled by their initial encounters with the indigenous peoples of the Americas. From this era sprang apocalyptic and utopian visions that would inspire many subsequent generations of theorists. Most of these interpretations are considered pseudo-history, pseudoscience, or pseudo-archaeology, as they have presented their works as academic or scientific, but lack the standards or criteria. The Flemish cartographer and geographer Abraham Ortelius is believed to have been the first person to imagine that the continents were joined before drifting to their present positions. In the 1596 edition of his Thesaurus Geographicus he wrote, "Unless it be a fable, the island of Gator or Gades, Cadiz, will be the remaining part of the island of Atlantis or America, which was not sunk, as Plato reports in the Timaeus, so much as torn away from Europe and Africa by earthquakes and flood." The traces of the ruptures are shown by the projections of Europe and Africa and the indentations of America in the parts of the coasts of these three said lands that face each other to anyone who, using a map of the world, carefully considered them. So that anyone may say with Strabo in Book 2, that what Plato says of the island of Atlantis on the authority of Solon is not a figment. Early influential literature. The term utopia, from no place, was coined by Sir Thomas More in his 16th-century work of fiction Utopia. Inspired by Plato's Atlantis and travelers' accounts of the Americas, More described an imaginary land set in the New World. His idealistic vision established a connection between the Americas and utopian societies, a theme that Bacon discussed in The New Atlantis, c. 1623. A character in the narrative gives a history of Atlantis that is similar to Plato's and places Atlantis in America. People had begun believing that the Mayan and Aztec ruins could possibly be the remnants of Atlantis. Impact of Mayanism. Much speculation began as to the origins of the Maya, which led to a variety of narratives and publications that tried to rationalize the discoveries within the context of the Bible and that had undertones of racism in their connections between the Old and New World. The Europeans believed the indigenous people to be inferior and incapable of building that which was now in ruins, and by sharing a common history, they insinuated that another race must have been responsible. In the middle and late 19th century, several renowned Mesoamerican scholars, starting with Charles Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg, and including Edward Herbert Thompson and Augustus Le Plongeon, formally proposed that Atlantis was somehow related to Mayan and Aztec culture. The French scholar Brasseur de Bourbourg traveled extensively through Mesoamerica in the mid-1800s, and was renowned for his translations of Mayan texts, most notably the sacred book Popol Vuh, as well as a comprehensive history of the region. Soon after these publications, however, Brasseur de Bourbourg lost his academic credibility, due to his claim that the Maya peoples had descended from the Toltecs, people he believed were the surviving population of the racially superior civilization of Atlantis. His work, combined with the skillful, romantic illustrations of Jean-Frédéric Waldeck, which visually alluded to Egypt and other aspects of the Old World, created an authoritative fantasy that excited much interest in the connections between worlds. Inspired by Brasseur de Bourbourg's diffusion theories, the pseudo-archaeologist Augustus Le Plongeon traveled to Mesoamerica and performed some of the first excavations of many famous Mayan ruins. Le Plongeon invented narratives, such as the Kingdom of Mu saga, which romantically drew connections to him, his wife Alice, and Egyptian deities Osiris and Isis, as well as to Heinrich Schliemann, who had just discovered the ancient city of Troy from Homer's epic poetry, that had been described as merely mythical. He also believed that he had found connections between the Greek and Mayan languages, which produced a narrative of the destruction of Atlantis. The 1882 publication of Atlantis, The Antediluvian World by Ignatius L. Donnelly stimulated much popular interest in Atlantis. He was greatly inspired by early works in Mayanism, and like them, attempted to establish that all known ancient civilizations were descended from Atlantis, which he saw as a technologically sophisticated, more advanced culture. Donnelly drew parallels between creation stories in the Old and New Worlds, attributing the connections to Atlantis, where he believed the biblical Garden of Eden existed. As implied by the title of his book, he also believed that Atlantis was destroyed by the Great Flood mentioned in the Bible. Donnelly is credited as the father of the 19th century Atlantis revival and is the reason the myth endures today. He unintentionally promoted an alternative method of inquiry to history and science, and the idea that myths contain hidden information that opens them to ingenious interpretation by people who believe they have new or special insight. Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophists. Map of Atlantis according to William Scott Elliott, The Story of Atlantis, Russian edition, 1910. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophists, took up Donnelly's interpretations when she wrote The Secret Doctrine, 1888, which she claimed was originally dictated in Atlantis. She maintained that the Atlanteans were cultural heroes, contrary to Plato, who describes them mainly as a military threat. She believed in a form of racial evolution, as opposed to primate evolution. In her process of evolution, the Atlanteans were the fourth root race, which were succeeded by the fifth, the Aryan race, which she identified with the modern human race. In her book, Blavatsky reported that the civilization of Atlantis reached its peak between 1,000,000 and 900,000 years ago, but destroyed itself through internal warfare brought about by the dangerous use of psychic and supernatural powers of the inhabitants. Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy and Waldorf schools, along with other well-known theosophists, such as Annie Besant, also wrote of cultural evolution in much the same vein. Other occultists followed the same lead, at least to the point of tracing the lineage of occult practices back to Atlantis. Among the most famous is Dion Fortune in her esoteric orders and their work. Drawing on the ideas of Rudolf Steiner and Hans Horbiger, Egon Friedel started his book Kulturgeschichte des Altertums, and thus his historical analysis of antiquity, with the ancient culture of Atlantis. The book was published in 1940. Nazism and Occultism. Blavatsky was also inspired by the work of the 18th-century astronomer Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who had orientalized the Atlantis myth in his mythical continent of Hyperborea, a reference to Greek myths featuring a northern European region of the same name, home to a giant, godlike race. Dan Edelstein claims that her reshaping of this theory in The Secret Doctrine provided the Nazis with a mythological precedent and a pretext for their ideological platform and their subsequent genocide. However, Blavatsky's writings mention that the Atlantean were in fact olive-skinned peoples with Mongoloid traits who were the ancestors of modern Native Americans, Mongolians, and Malayans. The idea that the Atlanteans were Hyperborean, Nordic supermen who originated in the northern Atlantic or even in the far north, was popular in the German Ariosophic movement around 1900, propagated by Guido von List and others. It gave its name to the Thule Gesellschaft, an anti-Semite Munich lodge, which preceded the German Nazi Party, see Thule. The scholars Carl George Sketzke, 1920, and Hermann Wirth, 1928, were the first to speak of a Nordic Atlantean or Aryan Nordic master race that spread from Atlantis over the northern hemisphere and beyond. The Hyperboreans were contrasted with the Jewish people. Party ideologist Alfred Rosenberg, in The Myth of the 20th Century, 1930, and SS leader Heinrich Himmler made it part of the official doctrine. The idea was followed up by the adherents of esoteric Nazism such as Julius Evola, 1934, and, more recently, Miguel Serrano, 1978. The idea of Atlantis as the homeland of the Caucasian race would contradict the beliefs of older esoteric and theosophic groups, which taught that the Atlanteans were non-Caucasian brown-skinned peoples. Modern esoteric groups, including the Theosophic Society, do not consider Atlantean society to have been superior or utopian, they rather consider it a lower stage of evolution. Edgar Cayce. The clairvoyant Edgar Cayce spoke frequently of Atlantis. During his life readings, he claimed that many of his subjects were reincarnations of people who had lived there. By tapping into their collective consciousness, the Akashic Records, a term borrowed from Theosophy, Cayce declared that he was able to give detailed descriptions of the lost continent. He also asserted that Atlantis would rise again in the 1960s, sparking much popularity of the myth in that decade, and that there is a Hall of Records beneath the Egyptian Sphinx which holds the historical texts of Atlantis. Recent times. As continental drift became widely accepted during the 1960s, and the increased understanding of plate tectonics demonstrated the impossibility of a lost continent in the geologically recent past, most lost continent theories of Atlantis began to wane in popularity. Plato scholar Julia Annas, Regents Professor of Philosophy at the University of Arizona, had this to say on the matter. The continuing industry of discovering Atlantis illustrates the dangers of reading Plato. For he is clearly using what has become a standard device of fiction, stressing the historicity of an event, and the discovery of hitherto unknown authorities, as an indication that what follows is fiction. The idea is that we should use the story to examine our ideas of government and power. We have missed the point if instead of thinking about these issues we go off exploring the seabed. The continuing misunderstanding of Plato as historian here enables us to see why his distrust of imaginative writing is sometimes justified. One of the proposed explanations for the historical context of the Atlantis story is that it serves as Plato's warning to his fellow citizens against their striving for naval power. Kenneth Fader points out that Critias' story in the Timaeus provides a major clue. In the dialogue, Critias says, referring to Socrates' hypothetical society, "And when you were speaking yesterday about your city and citizens, the tale which I have just been repeating to you came into my mind, and I remarked with astonishment how, by some mysterious coincidence, you agreed in almost every particular with the narrative of Solon." Fader quotes A. E. Taylor, who wrote, "We could not be told much more plainly that the whole narrative of Solon's conversation with the priests and his intention of writing the poem about Atlantis are an invention of Plato's fancy." Location hypotheses. Since Donnelly's day, there have been dozens of locations proposed for Atlantis, to the point where the name has become a generic concept, divorced from the specifics of Plato's account. This is reflected in the fact that many proposed sites are not within the Atlantic at all. Few today are scholarly or archaeological hypotheses, while others have been made by psychic, e.g., Edgar Cayce, or other pseudoscientific means. The Atlantis researchers Jacques Collina-Girard and Georgios Diaz-Montexano, for instance, each claim the other's hypothesis is pseudoscience. Many of the proposed sites share some of the characteristics of the Atlantis story: water, catastrophic end, relevant time period, but none has been demonstrated to be a true historical Atlantis. In or near the Mediterranean Sea. Most of the historically proposed locations are in or near the Mediterranean Sea, islands such as Sardinia, Crete, Santorini, Thera, Sicily, Cyprus, and Malta, land-based cities or states such as Troy, 81, page needed, Tartessos, and Tantalus, in the province of Manisa, Turkey, wink with a frown 82, Israel Sinai or Canaan wink with a frown citation needed, and northwestern Africa, including the Rikat structure in Mauritania. The Thera eruption, dated to the 17th or 16th century BC, caused a large tsunami that some experts hypothesize devastated the Minoan civilization on the nearby island of Crete, further leading some to believe that this may have been the catastrophe that inspired the story. In the area of the Black Sea, the following locations have been proposed: Bosporus and Ancona, a legendary place near Trabzon. Others have noted that, before the 6th century BC, the mountains on either side of the Laconian Gulf were called the Pillars of Hercules, and they could be the geographical location being described in ancient reports upon which Plato was basing his story. The mountains stood at either side of the southernmost gulf in Greece, the largest in the Peloponnese, and that gulf opens onto the Mediterranean Sea. If from the beginning of discussions, misinterpretation of Gibraltar as the location rather than being at the Gulf of Laconia, would lend itself to many erroneous concepts regarding the location of Atlantis. Plato may have not been aware of the difference. The Laconian pillars open to the south toward Crete and beyond, which is Egypt. The Thera eruption and the Late Bronze Age collapse affected that area and might have been the devastation to which the sources used by Plato referred. Significant events such as these would have been likely material for tales passed from one generation to another for almost 1,000 years. In the Atlantic Ocean. The location of Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean has a certain appeal given the closely related names. Popular culture often places Atlantis there, perpetuating the original Platonic setting as they understand it. The Canary Islands and Madeira Islands have been identified as a possible location west of the Straits of Gibraltar, but in relative proximity to the Mediterranean Sea. Detailed studies of their geomorphology and geology have demonstrated, however, that they have been steadily uplifted, without any significant periods of subsidence, over the last 4 million years, by geologic processes such as erosional unloading, gravitational unloading, lithospheric flexure induced by adjacent islands, and volcanic in the Atlantic were also identified as possible locations, notably the Azores. Similarly, cores of sediment covering the ocean bottom surrounding the Azores and other evidence demonstrate that it has been an undersea plateau for millions of years. The area is known for its volcanism, however, which is associated with rifting along the Azores Triple Junction. The spread of the crust along the existing faults and fractures has produced many volcanic and seismic events. The area is supported by a buoyant upwelling in the deeper mantle, which some associate with an Azores hotspot. Most of the volcanic activity has occurred primarily along the Terceira Rift. From the beginning of the island settlement, around the 15th century, there have been about 30 volcanic eruptions, terrestrial and submarine, as well as numerous, powerful earthquakes. The island of São Miguel in the Azores is the site of the Sete Cidades volcano and caldera, which are the byproducts of historical volcanic activity in the Azores. The submerged island of Spartel near the Strait of Gibraltar has also been suggested. In Europe, a map showing the hypothetical